Hey everyone, welcome back to Capital Connection. I'm Conan Smith. I am the president and CEO of the Michigan Environmental Council, and I am excited to welcome you back for a fun conversation today. I'm coming to you from the Windy City. I'm in Chicago today, so apologies for the blurry background, but we're going to be talking today about the Motor City, and we are joined today by Dr. Joe Cialdella. Joe is at the University of Michigan, and we met over a PhD internship program that he manages there. And as we were doing some of the background, I saw that he wrote this really fantastic book on Detroit's environmental story and looking back into the history of the city with regards to parks and gardens and green spaces. And as Sandra knows, this is a passion for us at the Environmental Council. We love healthy cities and the role that nature plays in those places, and we're developing programming pretty consistently to help enhance that work. As I was reading Joe's book, which we'll talk about a lot today, it really put the sort of historical development of that in a new light, and it was eye-opening, Joe. I'm so grateful. And I'm so grateful to have you here with us to talk about it. So welcome to MEC.
Thank you for that very, very kind introduction, Conan. I really appreciate it. And I'm excited to be here.
And of course, you all know the iconic Sandra Turner Handy. Sandra used to be our engagement director, and now she is senior advisor to the president. We had to give her a longer title on the business card. So Sandra and I work hand in glove trying to figure out our urban policy, our race and environment work, elevating the concepts of equity in the work that the Environmental Council is doing. Sandra, welcome back to Capital Connection.
Thank you so much. And I love being here and having an awesome co-host on this one. Thank you, Joe, for coming in on this with us.
So, Joe, let's start just by talking about the book that you've written. You and Sandra both share this sort of underlying interest and passion for green spaces and urban spaces. You came into this in a kind of like a different way. Like Sandra was born and raised in the city of Detroit. She has that lived experience. What motivated you to begin this investigation and to do the cataloging that resulted in this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I moved to Southeast Michigan for college and kind of became really interested through some courses that were engaged with the city of Detroit at the University of Michigan's residential college, and really got introduced to urban gardening that way, and have continued that interest, and was really just inspired by how people on the ground were really reclaiming spaces and revitalizing communities through gardening projects to better meet their needs in the wake of urban decline and policies that created it. So that kind of present day interest in it really led me as someone who's interested in history and how things got to be the way that they are, really led me to wonder, like, what was the longer history of how this urban gardening and urban greening movement in Detroit got started, and what the kind of precedents for it were historically.
And Sandra, I sort of, like, that was a quick and dirty introduction of you in this space, but can you talk a little bit about, like, your own personal engagement and passion in parks and natural areas in the city?
I always revert back to the personal story of my youngest son, who is now 28 years old. Having grown up in the East Side community, where my son has never played on a playground in his own area. I've always had to take him outside the community in order for him to have a safe space in which to play, and for you not to have a viable playground or just a green space where kids can get out and run and play on the swings and different things like that was just not acceptable to me. And then working with some of our seniors at Denby High School, one of the things they said was they didn't have a safe place to hang out. Well, of course not. We have no parks or recreational opportunities within walking distance. So working with MEC and some of our funders, we were able to create that space for our young people, you know, to give them those opportunities. And it has expanded into more urban green space for families. And now we're doing urban green space for just community members to be able to sit and just watch the world go by. You know, that piece of sitting in green space not only enhances our physical health, but also our mental health. And so that's why that's part of the passion, and MEC has always been supportive of raising the quality of life in communities, and that's a big part of it.
Joe, in the book, you talk about 3 types of green space in the city, which are not all the green space, right? But sort of 3 categories: parks, camps, and gardens. And you talk about the naissance of these spaces being directly related to the very human needs that were emerging in the city as it grew and as it declined. Those were different motivating factors. And I'm excited to talk about each of those 3 spaces, but you also sort of articulate an ethos, an ethic about environmentalism in Detroit that rides over all of the different creations of these spaces. And for me, it was inspiring to think about Detroit environmentalism as having very deep and long-lasting roots that go back to the very creation of the city. Can you talk about that high level, like overarching environmental phenomena that you saw as you did this research?
Yeah, sure. I really think, as Sandra kind of pointed to, it really was rooted in Detroiters of over a course of many generations wanting to really improve their quality of life, especially Detroit. I kind of start with Detroit's industrial rise and looking at how Detroiters really wanted to kind of ameliorate or improve the quality of life in a really industrial place through nature and green spaces. And so the kind of environmental ethic that we see in Detroit is really started out with places like Belle Isle wanting to bring nature closer to an industrial place and provide some sense of like relief for people in the city and kind of instill you know, a sense of health and well-being by connecting with nature and green space. And I think they saw it as improving the quality of life, an image of Detroit as like a nationally prominent industrial city in a similar way to, you know, Central Park in New York. They, you know, city leaders in the late 19th century in Detroit really wanted to have something like Central Park, and Belle Isle really became that for Detroit in a lot of ways. And they saw parks as a way to not only help people, I think, in their kind of middle class sense of how they could help the masses of workers and folks in Detroit, but also how they could help improve Detroit's image as a city, a rising, growing city.
Let's dig into Belle Isle a little bit. It is a space with storied history. It was, as you are suggesting, Joe, a place that was designed for intended to elevate the profile of Detroit as one of the national city spaces in that national profile. In recent years, it's become a space that is, Sandra, you might say, a little more controversial because of takeover of management by the state and questions about who is welcome there. That you talk about in your book, Joe. The question of who is welcome has been a perennial one. Sandra, can you give us a little sense of like the contemporary challenges or social structures around Belle Isle that you see and experience in the city?
Belle Isle, my playground. I grew up across the street from Belle Isle. I mean, every day after school, I can go to Belle Isle and hang out. It was a place for after church on Sundays, families come out. We had the zoo, we had canoes, we had horseback. We had the zoo with the horseback riding, you know, we had bike riding around the island. And the island was necessarily ours. It belonged to us. Well, with the takeover of the island, and I don't want to say takeover because it kind of sounds hostile, but the aftermath of it is what's become hostile. I was told a couple of years ago about the number of people that have came and visited Belle Isle in the last year or so and how great that number is. And I asked, how many are Detroit residents? Because that number dwindles. It's less and less. The fact that residents now have to pay if they're driving over, they have to pay. The fact that our law enforcement on the island, the state police, that may not be necessarily in tune with people of color and how they enjoy the island. So we see a lot of people getting stopped and ticketed, of color on the island. And it forces many residents to push out into their neighborhood parks and not necessarily enjoy the gym that was my playground. It was the place everyone went. Scott Fountain, with the changing of colors in the evening was awesome, and now that is not something that people do.
Joe, you talk a little bit in the book about this phenomena it's not alone a contemporary phenomena. We saw this happening with the emergence of the Huron-Clinton Watershed Authority, similar tensions around ownership and access. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. And I would say going back, Belle Isle was a place that was really vested with its creators' ideals. Like you can see the image on the screen. There were a lot of, rules and that you had to follow in the early days of Belle Isle to kind of be accepted and be a part of it. So it really became a more open public space over the course of its life. And some of that, as Sandra was pointing to, has been more restricted in recent years than it had been. But kind of one of those key turning points that's in the book is the creation of the Huron-Clinton Metropolitan Authority in the 1940s. Voters voted to fund and create it and use kind of resources from the city and from Wayne County to create this really vast and exciting network of parks that really went along the waters of the Huron and Clinton rivers, which make a really broad arc around Southeast Michigan. And the kind of idea for a regional park system like that is really exciting and great, but kind of in practice, Detroit really got left out of that picture because at the same time, there were really basically racist social policies like redlining that made it very difficult for African-American communities to move to suburban regions, while these tax dollars to support this network of parks were being directed to outlying areas. And so these really great parks got built outside of the city while resources were being taken away from supporting places like Belle Isle. And that's kind of why you end up with a situation where the state park system took it over and now there's a fee because the city itself didn't have or wasn't provided with the resources to sustain it as a freely open kind of public space as in many ways its founders intended to be, or people used it that way throughout its life. And so that's why there's this sense that it's been kind of restricted because those historical precedents that took resources away from it really help Belle Isle see hard times, unfortunately. So I think there are a lot of historical reasons why that those green spaces in Detroit aren't as as well kept or as well funded as they are in outlying areas. And I think now we're starting to see some of that change, but I think part of the environmental ethic of those doing urban gardening and doing urban greening in the city today is really to right those historic inequities and injustices by better funding and supporting parks and green spaces that are open to everyone.
Joe, you note that race and class have had indelible effects on Detroiters' sense of environmentalism and on the presence of green space in the city. One of the ways that is manifested is through urban gardens, whether they are for delivering food or beautifying spaces. Can you talk a little bit about Mayor Pingree's potato patches and the emergence of urban gardening as a sort of critical component of city life?
Sure. So I mean, at a similar time as Belle Isle is being created in the late 19th century, there was a mayor of Detroit, Hazen Pingree, who, in order to kind of help poor and impoverished residents, specifically a lot of recent Polish and German immigrants to the city, use vacant spaces and kind of some outlying areas in the city to create a city-supported urban gardening program. So urban gardening, although today it's a really grassroots kind of movement and effort, really started off in Detroit as a city-sponsored program to help feed people during an economic recession. And in that sense, it's in some ways sort of similar to the environmental logic of Belle Isle, where city leaders really wanted a space to help bring nature to the city and ameliorate kind of the negative consequences of industrial capitalism. And kind of the other side of that is because of the economic recession, people needed food and needed to learn how to grow food again, even though they had probably moved to a city to escape farming life or make a better living as an industrial worker. So the potato patches are kind of the first precedent for urban gardening in Detroit. Mayor Pingree wanted the program to continue and even imagined like really big agricultural parks in the city that could help support and feed residents. That never really materialized because these kind of movements really tended to ebb and flow in interest and really coincided with moments of economic recession. And then people got less interested in gardening. But it's also a parallel story kind of a little bit later when African Americans start moving to Detroit in larger numbers. In the early 20th century, many of them also had smaller yard gardens or kind of on patches of land gardens to help feed and support one another when there were either economic challenges or to eat healthier food or to bring with them some of the gardening traditions they had in the South. So there were many different reasons that different communities in Detroit's history had an interest in gardening and really tried to sustain and grow urban gardening, including during the Great Depression in the 1930s, the city again supported what were called thrift gardens, and large numbers, especially immigrant populations, were often farming those garden plots to have food and sustenance for themselves. By the time we get to the 1980s and 1990s, you start to see more the direct roots of kind of the urban gardening on a grassroots level that we see today in the city, supported in a wide way by nonprofits and kind of organizations of communities and neighborhoods in the city, which I'm sure Sandra can speak more to as well. But kind of there's a long history of urban gardening, and I think today it's really been more sustained and maybe more prominent than it has been in the past, because there is that greater sense of a grassroots interest in it rather than a more top-down, like Pingree's potato patches definitely helped a lot of people, but part of the reason they, I think, couldn't be sustained is because there wasn't as much grassroots support and interest in them as a project and endeavor.
Sandra, we know that urban gardening can be oriented around food security for some folks, but it's also a spiritual expression of the connection to land and nature. And I sense that a lot in the city, like just in the sense of pride and ownership in those urban gardens. Is that a fair way to characterize it?
It is. And as you see more and more families of color moving from down south up north, the one thing that they were always told is own a piece of land. You have to own if you own a piece of land, you have made it in this world by owning property. But we also, so we had that sense of ownership and being able to have our backyard gardens that help feed our families, because of course we weren't making much money, in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s even, so having those gardens helps to sustain our families. But it also showed us that, land ownership was just an important concept in families, but then we have to look at how the environment kind of shifted that thinking. In the late 80s, 90s, and 2000s, You know, we lived in an urban society, but we had no major grocery stores. They all began to close. They all began to move out of the city. They either closed or moved out of the city. So we were left with, as far as fresh fruits and vegetables, was Easter market on a Saturday morning, you know, and how many people had cars to go to Easter market and pick up 50 pounds of potatoes, you know, on a Saturday morning, you know? And so again, we went back to our roots of having those backyard gardens to help feed our families. You know, we had some real urban farmers that patched together land in order to have real farms in the city and provide us with fruits and vegetables. So it became a sense of survival if we did not want to purchase apples and bananas in the corner liquor store, which was, you had no idea how long it's been there, the quality of the food, you know, and as people that are known to have a lot of underlying conditions due to what we eat and the environment in which we live, we really do want fresh fruits and vegetables. So the Detroit Food Policy Council and City Council together, you know, created that grassroots impact on urban farming and community gardens and backyard gardens, revitalizing all of that so that people could have access to fresh fruits and vegetables in the city.
The idea around race and environment for us inside MEC is really about elevating to a white majority that controls a lot of public policy that Black communities have long had, for generations, had this deep connection to native spaces. And unfortunately, those communities have often been paved over. These native ecologies that we have in Michigan, some of the most interesting ones are underneath the city of Detroit now, under blacktop and concrete. But that passion for connection to those places still always existed. And we saw with the development of Idlewild, an opportunity for Black families to escape into the northern Michigan woods in a place that was safe and still connected to nature. It turns out, and I didn't know this until I read your book, Joe, there's also a camp for Detroit kids in Jackson. Can you talk a little bit about Green Acres?
Sure, yeah. Green
Pastures
Camp was started by the Detroit Urban League, which is a social service organization in the city, in the 1930s, kind of during that Depression era, as an effort. Really, it was youth focused to bring youth from the city out to a more natural place. They thought, you know, that it would be an opportunity to feed them on the one hand, but also kind of give them the benefits that come with being outdoors in nature, kind of provide them some educational opportunities at the camp to learn, and really just be, have an escape from the city. So they would bus kids during the summers out to a lake near Jackson, Michigan. The camp is unfortunately no longer there, but it really was another example of how, because there wasn't always a welcoming kind of neighborhood park especially for African-American communities in Detroit, they had to find these places outside of the city and in areas that were safe for them. Because of funders, they were able to purchase this land and owned it and brought kids there for several decades. So it really was another kind of piece of that story, and the really significant way that African-American communities shaped kind of an environmental ethic in Detroit that was both, you know, urban as well as about getting out to natural areas outside the city, but still with the idea that you know, it was a way to help urban residents kind of find nature and have a connection to a place and appreciate the nature that they would then find when they went back to the city too.
Sandra, I see you nodding and smiling here, like this.
Only because I benefited from those type of programs in the city. You know, having grew up in what we call the concrete jungle, that's our name for urban cities. In the summertime, my sisters and brothers and I, we through a local church worship to a camp a little bit up north called Stapleton, you know, right past the thumb of the city. And even now, you know, MEC sits on a group called Semi-Wild, you know, where we're still trying to connect urban youth to natural resources, because we don't have, like, as I said, we don't have a lot of those. You know, we have Belle Isle, you know, but where else do we find natural ecosystems where our children can enjoy them, or go somewhere and jump in a lake and swim, you know, and see creatures where my grandson doesn't think a rabbit is a dog. You understand what I'm saying? So yeah, to have benefited from being able to be shipped out of the city during the summer into natural spaces was awesome for me.
We at the Environmental Council helped coordinate Proposal 1 in 2020, which amended the Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund funding formula to allow greater investment in development activities. Our hope and expectation is that some of those development activities are really about restoring native ecologies in urban areas so that the residents, especially the children, can have access to nature in as pure a form as you can get inside the context of a bustling urban area. We're really excited to begin this project with some funding from DTE Energy. One of the things we're going to be doing is mapping the equitable access to native spaces across certain geographies, whether that's metropolitan Detroit or Metro Grand Rapids, for example. Because we know that if you live in a place like Ann Arbor, for example, where I live, and there's been significant public investment in maintaining access to native ecologies, urban residents get that. In our more densified urban areas, sometimes that's missing. If you live in rural areas in Michigan, you have easy access to those. So we're really curious to see if the data shows out sort of an inequitable access to native ecologies. And then we want to dig into fixing that with some investments from state government through the trust fund. So Sandra is going to be pulled into that project. This might be news to her as of today, but we have a new urban and infrastructure policy manager, Ross Gavin, who's going to lead that project. He's partnered up with Reese Dillard, who's our first race and environment fellow inside the organization, and we're gonna be working on that, building off of many of the principles, Joe, that you've articulated in your book about this attachment to urban ecology. As we wrap up here, Joe, tell us about like what you walked away from the process of writing this book with. What is lingering in your head and in your heart at the completion of that project?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I mean, I think just a real sense of the longer history and way in which Detroit has been a really leader in the environmental movement and really creating urban environmental spaces and kind of an urban environmental ethic, which I think it's often forgotten and mostly remembered as like an industrial place and a place where industry collapsed. And I think these other stories about how Detroit really played a central role in kind of shaping an urban environmental ethic with the input from many communities and individuals, especially African-American communities, given the city's demographics and population, I think is often forgotten. So that really stood out to me, as well as the kind of, you know, how that feeds into the work really happening at a grassroots level in the city today. And in terms of many people, environmentalists, I would call them, but they may not call themselves that, but who are interested in urban greening, urban gardening, growing fresh fruits and vegetables, who are really taking up that legacy and really using it to ameliorate or kind of right some of the past injustices in the city when there's been a lack of government will and support to do so.
Well, Dr. Joe Cialdella, Sandra Turner Handy, thank you both for joining us and having this conversation. If you're attending the webinar, you know that if you've asked a question that we didn't get to, we'll follow up via email. We'll also provide links to where you can pick up Joe's book and dig into this topic a little more in detail, because we couldn't cover all 200 pages of writing on it. For you all who are regulars, welcome back. And for you all who are new, we hope you'll come back. Up next, we're going to be talking about faith and environmentalism with the Michigan Interfaith Power and Light organization, one of MEC's member groups. So come back next week to join us for that. And to both of you, Joe, Sandra, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really great to have you both on.
Thanks so much, Sandra. Thanks, Conan.
And thank you, Joe. Have a great one, guys.
All right.
Have a
Take
good
care,
weekend, all.
everyone. See you next